So what we're going to focus on in this lesson is the exceptions we get back from our server. Now what we're seeing here is the developer exception page that's returned from .NET Core, and what catches our exception is this developer exception. And what we'll do is we'll go to our startup.cs class, and what we see inside here is the first piece of middleware, and exception handling middleware always comes at the top of our middleware container, because if an exception happens anywhere else in the middleware or as part of our request, then it gets thrown up to the next level of exception handling. Now, if we don't have any exception handling inside any of our methods, controllers, or middleware, then it's going to get thrown all the way up to our developer exception page, and that's the output that we see. So what do we see if we don't use this? What do we see if we comment out this particular page? And by the way, when we do see an exception like this, then the useful information is right at the top here, because it tells us what the exception actually was, and it also tells us exactly which line of code was responsible for producing this output. And if we go and take a look at line 38 in the buggy controller, then we can see that this is the very exact line that caused the exception. So when you do see exceptions, and you will, no matter how careful you are, then you've got a place to go and look and start the investigation. And then you can start to understand, well, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? What type of exception has occurred? What did it need that I didn't give it that caused this exception? These are all the sort of questions you should be asking yourself when you encounter something like this. But let's go and repeat that request without using the developer exception, because we've now commented that out. And if I click send, then what we get back is not very much. We get a 500 internal server error, but we don't get the stack trace and we don't get any information, because nothing's responsible now for returning that to us. We still get the exception in our terminal window because something has happened, and we still get the stack trace and the information about the exception, but nothing's doing anything with it. It's simply outputting the response that's being handled by our common language runtime in this case. That's responsible for showing us what we're seeing here. In the olden days, if you had something such as an unhandled exception, this would actually crash your, possibly crash your entire web server. In the older web server technologies, where they used to run every website off a single process, then a single badly coded application would bring an entire server down. But we've moved past those times, and website code is typically managed into its own isolated process now, so it's not a big deal. And also this is kind of caught by our common language runtime, and it doesn't actually crash our web server. It causes a problem, but our web server keeps on ticking, and it continues to send us responses. So anyway, now we've got an exception, and we're not doing anything to generate any output because we've disabled this. What we used to do in the olden days, once again, is we would actually need to handle exceptions inside each of these methods. When we write some code, we'd have to take a look and see what we're doing and figure out what inside here could cause an exception. And what we would need to do is we'd need to surround our code in try-catch blocks, and we would have a try block, and then we would have a catch block, and we'd specify exception inside the catch block, and say using system to get the exception, and then we could get the details of the exception inside this EX variable. And then we would have a block of statements about what we want to do. So we would take a look at our code and say, okay, we've got these 3 lines, and we'll put them inside the try block, and I'll just reformat. And we can say, right, okay, so we got our var thing. Can that cause an exception? Well, if we take a look at the find method, then this just sets the thing to null if it's not found in a database. We're not going to get an exception from this. But what we see next is, well, what if we put this to null and then we try and execute this method? This one could cause us a problem. So we'd want this code inside a try block so that if we do have an exception, we can do something and catch it in this catch block. So what we'll do, just for demonstration purposes, we're actually going to handle this exception ourselves inside this catch blocks. And what we'll do is we'll simply return a status code of 500 and then we'll say computer says no, exclamation mark. And if you're from the UK, that little statement might have some relevance to you, but if you're not, don't worry about it. It's just an error message that we're going to output to the client in this case, which is Postman. So let's go and take a look at the effect of that. So we're now handling this particular exception inside this catch block. So when this exception is encountered, it's going to throw an exception. And anything that's thrown can be caught, and what we'll do is try and catch it inside here, and if we do catch it, then we're going to return this status code with this message. So let's give this a go. And if we click on send, then what happens is we get our 500 internal server error. That's fine, that's the status we were sending back, and this time we get computer says no. What we don't see though, if we take a look at the terminal again, then we don't see any exception inside here. Even though we had an exception, because we've caught the exception inside our own catch block, we're not actually seeing the exception inside here anymore. And if I keep repeating that request, then even though we did see the exception details earlier, we're not seeing any exception details here. Now this is not a great idea because we've just silently swallowed the error. And sure, we send a response to the client, but we don't see any specific problems inside our terminal. So yeah, it's kind of cleaner inside here, but we don't look at this all the time, and we would like to know the details of what actually happened. Now the details are stored inside this exception, and we're not doing anything with that in there. And this is not the policy that we're going to take for our exception handling. What we want to look at doing is creating our own middleware so that we can do something very specific with any exceptions that we get, but we're going to catch them in a global way and then decide how we're going to respond to any exceptions that we receive. So I'm going to clean up this bit of code. We're not going to be using this anymore, and we're certainly not going to be wrapping all of our code in try catch blocks because it's not the 1990s. And what we'll take a look at next is how we can build our own global exception handling middleware.